So this is the second in a series of 3 walkthroughs. So I'm going to go a little faster on this one because I think you've already done the first one. And we're going to be doing, I only asked for absorption and variable, but we'll go ahead and do throughput as well, just to illustrate. So we're looking at 3 different methods, and we've got the data here for WatchCo. So the sales for each will be the same because that doesn't change among the methods. So the sales will be the sales price per unit times the units sold. And so all 3 methods will have the same sales. The difference between the 3 methods is how fixed manufacturing overhead is handled. Between absorption and variable and throughput, only inventory's material cost on the per unit level and labor and overhead of all kinds, manufacturing overhead, is expensed in the period. But sales is the same for all 3 of them. All right, so variable cost of goods sold. So the variable cost per unit is material plus labor plus manufacturing overhead. Add those together there, get our order of operations correct. And that's going to be times units sold. Then variable operating times units sold. So now we get the contribution margin, which is sales minus the variable cost that we have. And we have the contribution margin. Now, fixed cost of goods sold. So we need to come up with the fixed overhead rate per unit. You're given a couple of clues here because you know how many hours they budgeted, machine hours they budgeted, and how many units they can make per machine hour. So that helps you figure out how many units they budgeted for. And they told you they're manufacturing fixed overhead. So then you can come up with the rate per unit. And so that's the fixed overhead per unit. So fixed overhead times the units sold. It's going to go there. Now, volume variance. This is going to be a function of how many units you plan versus how many units you made. So how many units did they plan? 300,000. How many units did they make? They don't tell you, but we can figure that out. So production would have been sales plus the ending minus the beginning. So they would have produced that many units. So that would have been 5,100 fewer units. So we're going to have an unfavorable volume variance, which means that we're going to have an additional expense here. So it's going to be the volume we expected minus the volume we had times the fixed overhead per unit. And then the fixed operating costs were just given to you. The operating income will be minus those 3 items. So now let's look at variable costing. So the variable cost of goods sold is the same. The variable operating is the same, and the contribution margin is the same. What's different is for fixed overhead, we put the whole thing in. So we don't attach any of that fixed overhead to the units produced but not sold. Volume variance. In fact, if you look up here, you can see that you actually expense more fixed overhead than you incurred for the month. Why is that? Because some of the units that you sold from beginning, so you sold more than you produced. Some of the units in beginning inventory that had fixed overhead attached to them were sold this period. So that's a difference between the two. There will be no volume variance with variable cost because volume variance is just related to fixed overhead per unit, and we don't have fixed overhead per unit. Fixed operating will be the same, and then the calculation of operating income is the same calculation but a different result. So here the operating income is actually higher under variable, and that's because you sold off some inventory from a prior period. So the fixed cost of goods sold is actually higher here because some of the fixed overhead from prior periods that was on the balance sheet was released into the income statement. So when inventories are rising, variable costing will give you worse profits. But when they're dropping, when inventories are dropping, it goes the other way. All right, the variable cost of goods sold for throughput is just going to be the materials times the units sold, because everything else is expense. The variable, there's no difference. Fixed cost of goods sold is going to be all the labor, all the variable, times what was produced, plus the actual fixed overhead for the period. There'll be no volume variance. Fixed operating is the same. And then the calculation of operating income is the same. So throughput, only inventories materials. So the labor incurred during production, not based on units sold, but based on units produced, is expensed. All right, so there's one more after that. I'll go a little quicker on that one because it'll be your third time through. Again, you can print these off in a D2L Brightspace and work them on your own before doing the walkthrough with me.